الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا يا رب العالمين أما بعد. So we've been going through the great work of al-Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh. May Allah have mercy on him. His book called Qamar, the Alchemy of Happiness. And last week we left off just completing chapter 1, our exploration of chapter 1, where we were speaking about the knowledge of the self. And we left off with this point that where the Imam highlights and reminds us that the human being isn't really worth much in and of himself. The human being is very weak, not exactly the most productive of creation in and of itself, but the human being can rise to a very high rank if by means of the alchemy of happiness, which he has explained in the beginning is the ma'rifah and the recognition, the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says that if the human being doesn't fulfill their purpose and know who Allah is and thereby worship and serve Allah, then they're going to be worse than brutes and animals. Because the animals are serving their purpose. And so they're doing what they were created for. And if the human being does not do what they were created for, then they fall below the animals. Allah Ta'ala says this in the Quran. So we talked about this last week. And I wanted to share one more quote from this chapter before we move on to the next. The Imam says, it is necessary for the human being at the same time that they're conscious of their superiority as the climax of created things to learn to know also their helplessness. Look, he spent a lot of time highlighting for us the magnificence of the human being. How Allah has created within the human being this heart and this spirit, the ruh. This ruh that is from Allah. That is min amri Rabbi. From the affair or command of Allah. That's unique. Right? A literal translation of the verse of Quran would render it as Allah blew into the human being. وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. The human being is very unique in this regard. A part of the human being has this inclination to constantly yearn for Allah. And it is only through the worship of Allah that that part of the human is nourished. He says at the same time, remember, you need to know about your helplessness, as that too is one of the keys to the knowledge of God. What that means is we have to recognize that we will not know Allah unless Allah allows us to know Him. Allah, nothing is veiled from Allah. Allah sees and knows all. But human beings, in proportion to their attachment to other than Allah, can be veiled from Allah. And so we must recognize our helplessness in knowing Him. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana. O Allah, we will know nothing but that which you teach us, including knowing who Allah is. So part of, as he says, one of the keys to the knowledge of God is to recognize our helplessness in this matter, in this affair. Now, why do we keep talking about you need to know Allah, you need to know Allah? Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. This is a very famous verse, a very well-known verse amongst Muslims. This verse is a huge blessing. When most people are walking around trying to figure out what the purpose of life is, Allah, out of His infinite mercy, put it right there before us. I did not create jinn and humans except to worship me. It's laid out very clear. Ibn Jurayj, he says, إِلَّا لِيَعْرِفُونَ, except to recognize or know me, to know Allah. Now, why would there be a need to interpret it in that way? Do you understand my question? Like the ayah says, to worship me. Why would a scholar and a mufassir, a commentator like Ibn Jurayj, come along and say what Allah means, or what the interpretation of to worship me is to recognize me or know me? Why? Yeah.
We can't properly worship him if we don't know.
We cannot properly worship him if we don't know him. Well, one could make the argument that outwardly, show someone how to pray, teach them the words, Allahu Akbar, right? Subhanakallah wa bihamdik, they recite everything. Teach them how to fast. Teach them all the outward acts of it. There you go. You got them to worship. Do you really need the second part of knowing? What do you guys think? Yeah.
Yes, because if we know God, that time we appreciate everything He's giving us and He's blessing us with. That time the ibadah will not be only movement or just going tawaf or something like this. It will be meaningful.
Mm.
From our hearts.
Yeah, it will be meaningful. Yeah, beautiful. But what if it's not meaningful? It's still worship. No? What do you guys think? Yeah?
Maybe that's what Sunday means to Ayah. It begs the question, okay, how do I worship? It's like, okay, I'm worshiping, but what does it mean for me to worship? So that's why explanation is given that if you want to truly worship God, the best way or the way to do it is to recognize Him.
Okay. So the best way is through recognizing him. But without it, we're okay? Like if we don't know him, we can still worship?
And then that begs the question that what are you worshiping then?
Allah.
But then who is Allah then? That
Allah is the creator of the heavens and the earth. Is it good enough? We're good?
that's not we're not in that no.
Okay, so he didn't say in depth. He just said recognize. No. I'm just joking. Go ahead.
I think it's about like the sincerity at that point. Like how sincere can you be in your worship and how much khushu can you have? And if you're doing like just movements for the sake of movement without truly recognizing or loving Allah, then it's the sincerity aspect might waver a little bit. So to recognize and to know Him is to be God conscious and like incorporate Him into your daily thoughts and parts of your lives that typically don't require like not just during prayer time, but like in your daily life, like when you're at work or when you're just taking a walk. Are you observant? Are you looking at the creation as if like, oh, this is what Allah created for me to enjoy today, etc. So.
Okay, yeah. It's like a qualitative increase when you know God, you're saying. Okay. But if we didn't have the qualitative increase, hopefully I'm guessing we could still, because the ayah just said worship, right? So what you guys are saying is all about like excellence prayer, like beautiful prayer. But like I could still fulfill what the ayah says if I don't know God. Yeah, go ahead.
I think even the sister sort of suggests that there's also quantitative increase in that it's wrong to sort of limit our worship and submission just to those rituals like we can be taught that were outlined, but rather our worship of Allah has to happen consistently throughout all aspects of our life.
Okay.
It's probably only possible to.
Right. Okay. So let's do a thought experiment so we can kind of walk it through, and then you guys can let me know. Okay. Let's say we drag a guy off the street. We bring him in here. Stand up. He stands up. Repeat after me. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Right. And then you get him to say the words Subhanakallah. And he says Subhanakallah. And he says everything. He did the whole thing. MashaAllah. Right? And if he dies right after that, MashaAllah, he fulfilled the purpose of his life. He just worshipped God. Well, what do you think? What do you think?
I think knowing God differentiates us from other things that are alive but worship Him. Like plants worship God, trees, nature. They're always in worship of God, but knowing Him differentiates us. Like,
Yeah, but what about that guy? Does his prayer count? Like, what's the story with that guy?
So,
What if he's not Muslim? I just grabbed a random guy. He's a human being, right? And I got him to just worship. Yes, to me.
I was going to say that there are levels to it. So your worship fundamentally depends on your belief. And your belief depends on you knowing who Allah is.
Right.
As long as
Where
you
does
know
belief exist?
in the heart.
Mm.
As long as you have a base level of belief in who Allah is, not necessarily having rational proof or having thought of it so super deeply, then out of Allah's mercy, He will accept that.
Mm-hmm.
You might be worshipping to avoid the hellfire.
Yeah.
Out of His mercy, He will accept that. You might be worshipping because you want Jannah. Out of His mercy, He will accept that. But then the highest level is you worship Him for Him, and that's knowing Him, that entails knowing Him on a deeper level.
Mm-hmm.
But that still doesn't negate that there's still a precursory knowledge that you can have that is what enables acceptance of your worship.
It's required. Yeah, absolutely. It's required. See, the reason I gave that example of pulling a random guy in here and just getting him to say the words, because outwardly he did everything. What was his intention? Did he even have an intention? See, there's a famous hadith that in the body there is an organ, there's a piece of flesh. When it is rectified, then everything is rectified. When it is sound, everything is sound. When it is corrupt, then everything is corrupt. All the actions are corrupt. The Prophet ﷺ taught us that actions are based on intentions. Intentions are made in the heart. Belief exists in the heart. That it is from the heart that all actions, extend. And so if someone's doing the outward actions but lacking the source, which is belief, intention, any of that, then that cannot be accepted. That's not worship. That's just exercise. You're going up and down, you're stretching your knees and your legs, mashallah, and you're doing the whole thing, but that's not salat. So for salat, there needs to be a particular intention. And for that intention, you need to believe in Allah. And you need to know who He is at a very fundamental level to know that I'm worshipping this Allah. To then choose. Then the question of what would even drive you to worship? If you don't know who Allah is, why would you get up and take out time from your day to stand and pray to Him? If you have no idea who He is. Do you understand? That's why recognition and knowledge is an act of the heart. It is an act of the heart. That comes before the action of the limbs, which we often associate with outward forms of worship. Do you understand that? You cannot have the outward forms of worship if you do not have the source, the heart, to possessing knowledge or recognition of Allah. And so that's why this is such a fundamental and important point, is to know who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Now, the branch of philosophy that deals with the study of knowledge is called epistemology. It's a fancy word. It's just a branch where people study how to know and what can we know. And in the Quran, when we speak of knowledge, knowledge of God, but knowledge itself, we cannot downplay the importance of knowledge. You see, the example I just gave, where someone outwardly is doing the actions, but inwardly they don't possess knowledge. They don't know who Allah is. They don't have the intention to worship Him because they don't know who He is. They're just doing outward actions. That's not what we want. See, how do you become a better Muslim? Let me do more actions. Sometimes that's what you think. Let me do more actions. But if the source is corrupt, if the source lacks the knowledge of Allah, your heart, your recognition is lacking, naturally your actions will lack. Both in quantity and definitely in quality. Both. And so that's why when you look in the Quran, the root of Ain, Lam, and Mim, ilm, knowledge, it occurs over 850 times. Those root letters. Over 850 times. It's one of the most frequently quoted words in the Quran, like the root letters. Of course, the name Allah and Rabb and a few other words come before. But towards the top of the most frequently, mentioned root letters is Ain, Lam, and Mim. And after that, very closely following it, we have Iman, belief. Right? So your knowledge, your belief. Now, this tells us something about the centrality of knowledge in our religion. We cannot afford to be Muslims who are ignorant, who do not know. And seriously, there is this mentality sometimes amongst us as Muslims, as I just want to be a good Muslim. Like, I don't want to get into all the halaqas and the classes and the courses and the knowledge, as though that's kind of like some extra thing. I just want to be a good Muslim. So I'm just going to pray, fast, I'm going to do all these things. But you're going to be deficient, inevitably. If the knowledge is deficient, and again, one is if we think of knowledge purely as knowledge of outward forms of worship, so prayer and fasting and all of that, but then knowledge of the states of our heart, knowledge of who Allah is. And we'll talk a little bit more about, knowing Allah and what that really entails and the levels of that. The same root letters, Ain, Lam, Mim, you also get other words. You get a word alam. Alam meaning a sign, a mark, something that indicates to something. And then you also get the word alam, which is like the cosmos or the universe. And so what would the relationship be between knowledge, sign, universe? What do you guys think? Anyone? Yeah. Beautiful. Definitely. The universe, if we think of it as the creation of Allah and therefore a sign pointing to not only the existence of God, that's very foundational, but also pointing to who Allah is. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But definitely beautiful. Right? And the knowledge itself being a sign of Allah. The knowledge itself. When you study these words, are they just words? A very important distinction in our religion, our tradition, what knowledge is versus what you're studying in your courses in university, in college. For us, the goal was never words. The goal is never words. The goal is not to pass a test. The goal is not to pass a quiz. The goal is not to memorize certain, theories. The goal is to embody it. The knowledge that we seek, if we act upon it, it will be an argument in our favor on the Day of Judgment. That, oh Allah, this person learnt me and acted upon me, enter this person into Jannah. And if we don't, it is an adversary against us on the Day of Judgment. Hujjatun laka aw alayk, the Quran, and the knowledge of the Quran. And so, knowledge ought to guide us to Allah. And if it doesn't, we have to question, is it really true knowledge in the true sense of the word? That which helps you turn on the lights is not at its face value true knowledge. Sure, mundane actions can be converted into virtuous actions through intention. But there's a very big difference when you recite the Quran. The Quran is not here to teach you basic things about turning on lights and stuff like this and AI and quantum mechanics. Like, that's basic. Seriously. And you might say, like, do you know it? That's not the point. My point is not, do I know it? The point is, compared to what the Quran offers us, I remember having a conversation with one brother. We're talking, this was in Ramadan a few years ago, different city. And the brother told me, wallahi, he said, why would Allah not give the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if he was a prophet of Allah, why wouldn't he give him all of this scientific, knowledge and the scientific breakthroughs that we have today? Why would he not give it to the Prophet of Allah? I said, subhanallah. I said, he gave him far greater knowledge. Seriously? Far greater knowledge than mere theories and electricity and that. Really? You actually want to compare the two and say that they're on the same? They're not even in the same conversation. There's no amount of science that will tell you why you exist. Seriously speaking, there is no amount of science that will tell you why you exist. Why there's something rather than nothing. There's no amount of science that will account for so much of the arbitrariness that we see, the contingency that we see of the universe around us. Do you understand? And so people lived long before these scientific breakthroughs. And they lived, and they grew old, and they died. They had children. Oh, but life wasn't so comfortable for them. Okay. Okay. Life doesn't need to be so comfortable. Life doesn't need to be comfortable. But are you fulfilling your purpose? It doesn't matter how comfortable you are or not. Are you fulfilling your purpose? And if you're not, it doesn't matter what you have. With all due respect. It doesn't matter how much you've discovered and how much research you've done, how much money you make. None of that matters if you don't fulfill your purpose. As simple as that. And where do you learn your purpose from? From revelation. And who brought revelation? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do you understand that? The question is it's such a strange question when you think about it. The brother was innocent. He didn't really think about it carefully. But I tried to explain to him that, come on, do not belittle revelation by comparing the two, really. They're not even in the same conversation. Right? So, knowledge is meant to, guide us to Allah. And the universe around us is all signs, ayat. There are ayat Qur'aniyya and ayat kawniyya. Each verse of the Quran is an ayah, a sign that points to Allah, leads us to Allah. And the universe, the cosmos, also ought to lead us to Allah with the right perspective. That's why the believers don't sit there and just stare, looking at a solar eclipse going, wow. The believers stand up and pray. Yes, the believers stand up and pray the prayer of kusuf, of the solar eclipse. Because we're not meant to just stare at creation. You don't stare at a sign. When you were coming to Cambridge, you didn't just sit there looking at the sign going, oh, Cambridge. And if you did, well, may Allah help you. But you were meant to look and say, oh, that's the right exit. Let me take this exit, because this sign points me to where I need to go. If you don't follow the sign, then you haven't really understood the purpose of the sign. And think about the subject that you're studying, whether it be biology or neuroscience or whatever it is. Those are all signs, because you're studying some aspect of the cosmos, of the universe. And if that's not leading you to Allah, you don't have the right lenses on. Seriously. Okay. Now, Imam al-Ghazali, he says, by contemplation of his own being and attributes, man arrives at some knowledge of God. Notice how he says some knowledge of God. We will never truly and completely understand and know who Allah is. The finite cannot comprehend and encompass the infinite. And so he says, well, how? When a man considers himself, he knows that there was a time when he was non-existent. As it's written in the Quran, هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Does it not occur to man that there was a time when he was nothing? See, the time before the Prophet ﷺ came, and even during his time, some people, but usually when, before people receive guidance, what do we say? The days of what? Ayyamul Jahiliyyah. The days of what? What does Jahiliyyah translate as? Ignorance. It's interesting. Why don't we call it the days of sin? The days of oppression. The days of, I don't know, anything else. Yeah.
I guess because all of these things come from ignorance.
Yes. There are some who say that all sin is rooted in ignorance. Now, someone might make the argument, wait. No, but there are clearly people who do things wrong and they know perfectly well it's wrong. They know it's wrong and they still do it. So how can you make the argument that every sin is rooted in ignorance? Yeah. Yeah, what does that mean? Ignorance of the heart. فإنها لا تعمى الأبصار ولكن تعمى القلوب التي في الصدور. Yeah. But what's the difference between the knowledge of the heart and knowledge of the mind? What's the difference? It's still knowledge is knowledge, no?
I think you act based on what's in your heart. I think it's when push comes to shove, you act out of your heart, not your mind.
So every single time you're saying when someone sins, they don't know it to be wrong in their heart. Every single time.
It's a kind of ignorance, yes. Like they say at that time you're ignorant of either how azamat Allah or you're ignorant of the sin, that kind of aspect.
Yeah, exactly. What they're saying when they say that all sin is rooted in ignorance is someone might know that this is wrong, like it's not supposed to be done, but they haven't truly understood, or in that moment at least they forgot, or they're not aware of the reality of its punishment. Like, you might say, yeah, in Jahannam this is the punishment, in hell this is the punishment. They'll say it, they'll know the words. The punishment, in words is X, Y, Z. Do they truly understand what that represents? Because words are just words, but they represent meaning. Words are vehicles to meanings. Do you really understand the meanings? And the idea is that if you did, you would not sin. The fact that you're sinning means you don't fully comprehend how serious that punishment is. And so that's one way of thinking about it. Look, the days of ignorance, the people in the time of the Prophet ﷺ were not brutes. They were not cavemen or something, this idea of, people who just didn't know anything. They were brilliant people in terms of language, right? Military strategy. They were brilliant poets. Anyone who knows Arabic poetry and knows the Jahili poetry knows how challenging it is. It's very hard. I would venture to say most Arabs today would not understand it. And that's not an insult. That's just a fact. Right? It's very hard. And they would know these. They would memorize them. They would hear it once and memorize it. They would, impromptu come up with poetry on the spot, like freestyle. No, and this is not a small and easy task. So they understood. They were not ignorant in that sense. Why do we still call it the days of ignorance? Do you understand? Like they were not completely know nothing, clueless, walking around, in a daze or something. They were intelligent people. What ignorance are we talking about when we say the days of ignorance? Same. Let's not go so far back. What about you? A lot of you will talk about, well, I had my days of ignorance. What, like you didn't know 2 + 2 = 4? You knew that. Why do we call it days of ignorance? What changed? Yeah.
Ignorant of Allah and ignorant of their purpose.
Absolutely. Ignorance of who Allah Ta'ala is, ignorance of why we're here, why we exist, what our purpose is. So then how are you expected to find that? And so you look at yourself. You can start with yourself. Imam al-Ghazali says, look at yourself. Right? He says, do you forget that there was a time where you didn't exist? The Quran, he's quoting from the Quran, inspired from the Quran. Do you forget that there was a time where you did not exist? Now, here's the thing. At that time that you did not exist, you did not choose to come into this world. And even when you were in the womb of your mother, you did not choose to be the way you are. Do you understand that? Like, how much control did you have over who you are? You did not get to decide how tall you would be. You did not get to decide your genetics. Do you not recognize that there was someone making this decision? That someone was choosing this? We're not talking about the solar eclipse here. We're talking about you. You. And you can't deny that. You know this as a truth. There was a time where you did not exist, and now you're in existence, and the way that you exist today was not completely up to you. To a large extent, it was not up to you at all. And before you launch into but why this way or that? But the fact is, you didn't choose it. And so you must submit to the fact that there is a being that chose it, that decided that you would be the way you are today. That so many of the circumstances you find yourself in are seemingly arbitrary. Why should you be born into the family that you're born into with all the different characteristics? Why? There's no logical answer you can give there. Why is your soul in this body and not a different body? There's no answer there. Allah knows, and that's that. And you and I must submit to that. As much as we want to claim this and that about ourselves, this is a very fundamental thing. Before you get hyped up about being self-made and you're this and you're that and I'm this and I'm that, the Quran says, remember, so much of your own life that you think you're gonna, let me shape and build my own life and my dream life. You didn't even build yourself. Like you can choose your characters in the video game, you couldn't even choose your own character. So much was decided for you. Do you understand? That's a very humbling point and a point that causes us to submit and say, Ya Allah. It doesn't really matter how you feel about it. That's kind of irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make. But it's a fact that we have to face. That's what Imam al-Ghazali is reminding us of. You come to the knowledge of God when you recognize that you did not choose to be who you are. And that's okay. See, and then you look at the world around you. You look at the universe. And see, Tawheed, when you speak about Tawheed, the oneness of Allah. Tawheed, though, is not just oneness. That would be something like Wahdah. Tawheed is from Wahada yuwahidu Tawheed, which is to make one, to unify, to take a multiplicity, to take a bunch of things and unify them. Your goal is to see the world in all its multiplicity, but see how it all is unified in being the creation of one creator. It all goes back to Allah. We get caught up in the multiplicity though. And we see the puppets when we don't realize that puppets don't move themselves. There's always someone pulling the strings. That's what we do sometimes. So in a world of multiplicity, to see the one. In a world of seeming arbitrariness, to see that there is a judge and a ruler who decides how things are. See, there's the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. He spoke about this topic, this idea of called throneness. It's a really interesting idea. I won't even try to pronounce the German term for it. But it's translated as throneness. This is the idea that we just find ourselves in existence on earth, in seemingly arbitrary circumstances and conditions. You ever had that kind of existential realization one day? You kind of look around you and you go, this is so arbitrary. Why do I exist in 2024? Why not 1700? Why not in the time of the Prophet ﷺ? There's no real answer to that. There's just so many factors we look at in our lives that we realize we didn't really get to choose them. This throneness. And what's interesting is we don't even tend to notice the throneness until things go against what we'd expect or want. That's when we start. It's really interesting to see people suddenly roll up their sleeves, right? Shaykh, but why is it this way? Excuse me, we could ask that question about 90% of your life. Why this way and why that way? The moment something doesn't go the way you want it to go, immediately we roll up our sleeves and start asking it shouldn't be this way. What, everything else that's good in your life should be that way? According to what logic? Do you understand? We do that sometimes though, right? The one thing that doesn't go the way we want it to go, and now we're upset with Allah. Shaykh, I don't know why this is happening to me. What about all the good that's happening to you? Why is that happening to you? Because you deserve it? You don't deserve it. With all due respect. No, you don't. None of us are entitled to anything. It's hard, right? That's a difficult thing for some of us to palate, to swallow. But we have to, because it's a reality. All right? So the point is that we reflect on these points and these aspects of our lives and realize, wait, I must accept them as being from Allah. There will be certain things that I'm so happy Allah gave me. No? Are there not circumstances in your life that you are extremely happy and grateful that Allah gave you those circumstances? Are you not? I hope so. We should have an infinite number that we cannot count. And I mean infinite in an exaggerated way. Right? The Quran says you cannot encompass and enumerate every blessing that you have. You can't. Okay. So you have all of that. What about the stuff that you're not happy with? Okay, but they balance out. They really do. And we must be grateful for that. So it leads us to knowing. So Imam al-Ghazali then pushes us to reflect on the human being's existence. Number one, your existence, you didn't have to exist. You have no more right to exist than your unborn brother or sister. You know the millions of unborn brothers and sisters you have? That don't exist, literally. They're not here. Allah didn't choose for them to exist. But here you are. You know? How did you end up here? Because either you exist or you don't. One of two options. You exist or you don't. And you cannot have tarjih bila murajjih. And these are fancy terms in theology, in kalam. Preponderance. You know, choosing one of two options without there being a chooser. What? Do you understand? You could have existed or you could have non-existed. Not existed. But somehow your existence was chosen. But the atheist would have you believe that there was no chooser. Right? Yeah. And so, looking around the universe and existence, we not only know of God's existence, but we also know of what? His wisdom, His mercy, His love. We know of His omnipotence, His power. We start to notice how these things not just indicate God's existence, but also His attributes. Your biology, reflect on your biology. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, your own selves, you are signs of God. Reflect on your provisions. Like the fact that Allah has provided so much for us. It's really interesting. I mean, you could spend a lot of time, but again, that's why it's so important to notice the miraculous and the mundane. Things that we normally take for granted, to sit and say, wait, subhanallah. You take a seed and another seed, and the two seeds look very similar. There's no substantial difference in them. It's not like one of them has like a... You know if you make two different juices from powder? At the end of the day, each of the juices has like... It has the original flavor in it, just in a powder form. When you have two seeds, one's an orange seed for oranges, and one is for apples. Can you tell that? From the seed itself? Like, let me break it open and taste a little bit of apple in there? No. You just plant a seed in the soil. It's not like you feed it with apple flavor. You put water. And Allah produces for human beings apples. And with the orange seed, oranges. Where does the human being get to decide what flavor is in which seed? And how? Do you understand that? You can study the process. You cannot explain why the process is the way it is. And why it was not otherwise. Do you understand? These are things we take for granted. And that's our biggest mistake, is we take them for granted. We don't pause and reflect on these incredible realities. Allah speaks about this in the Quran. إِنَّ اللَّهَ فَالِقُ الْحَبِّ وَالنَّوَى. Allah is the one who splits the seed. He's the one who splits the seed and brings to, into being the different fruits that we eat. And different ones. We could have technically just ate one food our whole lives, no? Now you might say, no, Shaykh, because we have different needs and vitamins and stuff. We could have been created with just one need. Does your battery need like vitamins? It's like one energy source. Just fill it up with energy and you're good. Charge it with energy. Not like, oh, it needs this energy A and energy B and energy B12 or something. The human being, Allah created it with these needs and then created the means to fulfill the needs. Do you understand? Again, it seems obvious, but that's the problem. These things should not be so obvious. that we miss them. And then your soul, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, but I'm not going to continue with that. This is a book that I would advise here by Imam al-Ghazali called Concerning Divine Wisdom and the Creation of Man. This is one of his books attributed to him, and it's a translation of it by Dr. Qamar Riyaz. And in this book, Imam al-Ghazali is trying to highlight, looking at the creation of human beings, the divine wisdom in that creation. And his goal is what? That look, you can understand physical anatomy, but try to understand the deeper significance of that. How each of the aspects of the human points to Allah. And so I'd recommend this book, inshaAllah. We'll stop here, inshaAllah. We will continue in 2 weeks' time, inshaAllah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the tawfiq and the ability to make